And we're also going to be recording. So here we are live on Facebook. We're going to give Facebook a minute or two to let them know that we're live. If you're watching this on YouTube later, hello. There won't be a live Q&A with you on YouTube, but stay here because it's going to be a great conversation. So Robert, hello.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Welcome to Virtual Warwicks, both you and Jim.
Thank you.
Glad to have both of you here. So I always, my filling the airtime here is always kind of like, so where are you calling from? So Jim, where are you calling in from today?
I am calling from Gainesville, Florida, home of the University of Florida.
And what's your weather like there right now?
Well, it's hot and thinking about raining.
Okay. All right. Robert, I have a feeling you're close to where we are. Where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from La Jolla.
So for those
weather
of you
here today is a little clearer than it has been because we've had a lot of May gray and June gloom.
Yeah, it's we're definitely not hot like you are, Jim, but we've definitely got the cloud cover going on. And Robert's calling in from La Jolla, where for those of you, so we've got the two coasts covered. We've got the West Coast with Robert, and we got the East Coast with Jim. Hopefully a lot of you are joining us from in between those coasts. But just real quick, a little bit about Warwick. So Robert's up the street from us because we're located in La Jolla, which is just a little bit north of San Diego, California. So that's where we're at. My little sign there says 1896. So if you're joining us multiple times for these author talks, you hear me say this a lot, but we might have some new people joining us. So I always like to give a little bit of who we are. So we're not the oldest bookstore in the country, but we're the oldest continuously family-owned bookstore in the country. So we celebrated our 125th anniversary a couple years ago. So and they always carried books, which I thought in 1896, I think that's a pretty good thing. So for those of you that are joining us on Facebook today, I am going to put in the comment section both Robert's books and Jim's books. If you're in the San Diego area, we would love for you to stop by the store and buy those from us and pick them up and browse around at all the other great things. But if you're joining us from anywhere else in the country, independent stores actually do ship books. So we can ship you that book any place that you're located in the lower 48. We don't really do the Hawaii and Alaska thing. If you're also joining us on Facebook, in that comment section where I put the links for how to buy their books is also where you're going to put any questions that you have. So Jim and Robert are going to talk for about 30-ish minutes. So think of those questions. We love the audience questions. So you'll just put those into the comment section and I'll come back and bring those to the conversation in a little while. So with that, I'm going to introduce these two gentlemen and then we'll get on with the show. So Robert McCaw grew up in a military family traveling the world. He is a graduate of Georgetown University, served as a U.S. Army lieutenant, and earned a law degree from the University of Virginia. Having lived on the Big Island of Hawaii, Robert's writing is imbued by his more than 20-year love affair with this Pacific paradise. It says in your bio, we got to update your bio, that you might have lived in New York for a while, I'm taking it, Robert?
Well, we're bi-coastal. We have a place in New York and one out here.
Okay, so there you go. So we've got both coasts covered that way too. Retribution is his fifth I knew you're gonna say it for me, Robert.
Koakane
Hawaiian mystery series. I knew I was gonna blow some of those. I got them right in the green room, but we're live now. James Polkinghorn is a lawyer and partner in a national law firm specializing in labor and employment law. He has extensive trial and litigation experience accumulated in multiple jurisdictions throughout the country. A Pittsburgh native, James moved with his family to Florida in high school, where he has stayed since stayed, I should say. He has a degree in political science, as well as a law degree from the University of Florida. He lives in Key West now. Liquid Shades of Blue is his first novel. So they're going to be talking about their two novels. Gentlemen, have a great conversation. Robert, take it away.
Well, as you've just heard, Retribution is the latest in a series of 5 novels, all written about Koakane, the chief detective of the Hilo, Hawaii Police Department. And the books are part mystery, part thriller. They're all set in Hawaii. And in this one, Retribution, Koa sees his family and colleagues and significant other and friends attacked. His brother is framed for murder. His colleague, Makanui, is nearly assassinated. Nalani, his significant other, is targeted. Zeke Brown, his friend and the county prosecutor, is threatened. And his lawyer, Alexia Shepard, is nearly killed. As the attacks progress, Koa sees himself as the ultimate target of an unknown assailant. He races against time to identify the attacker and save himself and his precious Nalani. One of the unique aspects of this book and all 5 of the Koakani mysteries is that Hawaii, the Big Island, is a character in the series. And before we get much deeper into the whys and wherefores of making a place a character, I'm going to ask Jim to tell us a little bit about his book and how he came to write it.
Oh, thanks, Bob. Liquid Shades of Blue had been the basic story had been in my mind for a long time, and I've had a long, actually, as of last month, 40 years practicing law, and during that period, I was very interested in the idea of tragedy and tragic circumstances affecting people, not just the people that experience them personally, but the people near those people, and the effect that it has on them as well. And so this idea was in my head for a long time, and I finally got to a point in my career where I thought to myself, you know, if I don't write this down, if I don't actually produce this book, it's never going to happen. And so I did, and that was, you know, it's now been a couple of years since I wrote it, but here we are. It just came out last year or last month.
You know,
well, I suppose I should actually just say briefly what the story is. It basically follows the path of a young-ish lawyer, 30-ish lawyer, who had worked for his father at his father's firm in Miami. His father's a notorious plaintiff's lawyer in Miami, where my character, Jack Gerard, grew up. He's working for his father when a bad thing happens to him, essentially orchestrated by his father. And rather than confront his father, he essentially flees to Key West and buys a bar there. And that's where the story actually picks up. Is one Saturday morning, he wakes up essentially hungover, lying next to a beautiful Russian prostitute, and things take off from there.
You know, every book has a setting, but not every book, the setting is a character. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is why a setting becomes a character, how it becomes a character. And I think there's a group of factors that come into that. It's the depth of the descriptions, it's the detail, it's the uniqueness. It's multifaceted in the sense that it involves the geography, the history, the culture, the language, the climate, even the weather. And language is important. Spoken Hawaiian is lyrical, it's like music. And it helps create the connection between the characters and the setting, and the role that the setting plays in shaping the characters and their actions. For example, a place can evoke a character's memory or cause the character to do something in particular. One of the examples from Retribution is about one of Hawaii's famous black sand beaches. And there is a description, there's legend associated with that place. There's wildlife associated with it. There's history associated with it. And all of those things come in to helping make that place a part of this character that is Hawaii. Other examples, there's a discussion of South Point, the most southern place in the United States. Sorry about Key West and Florida, but Hawaii wins on that one. And it's got a fascinating history going back to World War II. And even before that, it's probably the place where the original Hawaiians landed on the Big Island. And then finally, you see it very much in the ending of the book, which occurs in the Thurston Lava Tube in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, where the lighting, the dampness, the color, the plant life in the cave, and its long and rather tortured history all help make it a real character in the setting. So maybe, Jim, you'd like to share some of your thoughts about how South Florida is so important in your book?
Well, I'll get to that, but I did want to ask you, as you were describing that process, how do you juggle that? How do you ensure that because there's so much in Hawaii to discuss and talk about and love and enjoy describing, how do you juggle that with moving the plot forward and keeping the focus on the characters and what they're experiencing? How do you do that?
It's an interesting question, and I've got to back up and tell you sort of how I started this whole process. I went out to Hawaii in the 80s. I fell in love with the Big Island. There was something just very dramatic about the 5 volcanoes that make up the island. And I started researching the history, and I started talking to Hawaiians and the Haoles, Westerners, about the islands and about their experiences. And the deeper I got into it, the more I wanted to share this with readers. And then the question was, well, how do I do that? And, like you, I'm a lawyer. I spent a lot of time doing internal investigations, figuring out who's telling the truth and who's not, managing the documents, figuring out who knows what, and put that together with a lifelong love of mysteries and puzzles. And I thought to myself, I'm going to tell this story through a detective story, through a police procedural, through a bit of a thriller. And it's the characters actually that came after the setting in that context. But the balance is always to be maintained as you put the story together. And I find myself doing a kind of an iterative form of writing. I go back and fix the things in the beginning that I need in order to get to the end. And that's probably where a lot of the balancing between setting and character development and plot all come together.
Yeah, and I do notice that, I read your book, Retribution. I got the advanced copy, thankfully. And I do notice that the plot in that book is fairly complex. There's a lot that goes on there, all of which is tied very nicely up at the end. How do you even think through your plots? And are you thinking about where the various scenes will be as you go through it?
Well, I've written a little article that's been published someplace on the internet about my favorite technique, which is misdirection. Misdirection is the ability to lay out a path and get the reader to buy into that path, get them out there on the tree limb and pull the rug out from under them and lead them off in a different direction. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to build into the book from the very first page. So if
actually what you're telling the listeners here is that when they think they've got this thing figured out, they don't.
Exactly. But there's a real catch to that, which is if you pull off the misdirection without enough guidance, without enough precursors, then the reader feels cheated.
Right. It feels like a trick.
How could you possibly have gotten there?
Yeah.
And so it's very, very important to build in those little hints that tell you that it may not come out the way you think it will.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, in my case, my plot isn't nearly as complex as yours is. There's really, when you think about this alleged suicide, which is what my book focuses on, is this character Jack Gerard's investigation of his mother's apparent suicide in Miami. There's really only a couple of ways this could go, three really, but what I found, what drives my story forward is really more the emotional relationships and the history, the interpersonal histories of the various characters. Now, having said all of that, it is set in what we consider to be, you know, a tourist destination of Key West and also Miami. And those I do consider, as you do in your book with Hawaii, they are, both of those places are characters in my book. And it's important to me that many of the scenes occur on water, which is so plentiful, and there's so much of it in both Miami and Key West to spend time on in various ways, which I've done most of my life. And so I wanted to bring that to the story as well and have people very interested in possibly going and seeing these things.
One of the things that I find challenging in putting a book together is getting the characters to interact with the setting. I mean, in our earlier discussions, you've mentioned the conversation that Koa has with his brother on the slopes of Mauna Loa.
Right.
It just seemed to me that the setting there on Mauna Loa with his brother returning from the beginning of this trip just makes that conversation work so much better and gives a place for it. You see the same thing in Koa's trip to the Black Sand Beach. He goes there because he thinks he has a special knowledge, and it turns out that special knowledge helps him. And you see that throughout the book, but it's always kind of this balancing of, does this setting fit with the action, and how is the setting itself driving the action? Right. Which are things that I spend a lot of time worrying about.
Yeah, and if you can't tie those things that way, it really just becomes a travelogue, and you know, with a mystery off to the side that you can solve. And you know, a reader might, in less capable hands, find him or herself just skipping pages to get to where the thing starts to move again. But that doesn't happen with you, and I really appreciate that. That's something I actually admire about your writing. So let me ask you this. I know that, you know, we've already discussed this a little bit, but both of us are lawyers, and I'm very interested in knowing how that training and experience actually affected your writing, both in terms of the process of writing and in substance, in terms of, you know, plot choices, etc.
I don't know about you, but when I was practicing law, it was always very important to stay within a certain parameter of what you thought was provable. Because if you go too far outside that, the judge looks askance at you, and you give your opponents opportunities to make you look bad, make your client look bad. So one of the problems that I had as a lawyer becoming a novelist is I was at the beginning much too stuck on the facts. And then as a novelist, you have this wonderful freedom to just make up the facts. Mm-hmm. And if the facts don't fit quite the story that you want to tell, then you just change those facts. That's one of the aspects of it. But I also think that my experience with prosecutors and with other lawyers, with clients, with investigators, all come into play in terms of the book. I mean, there are some legal scenes in the books. There's a judge, there's a prosecutor, there's search warrants, there are issues with respect to all of those. And most of those come from my legal career in one way or another. It actually is one of my favorite expressions that life for a novelist is research. you know, you go through life and you meet people and you pick up the characteristics of those people and you kind of put them in a bag. And when you're creating a character, you can reach into that bag and you can pull out the things that seem to work. I mean, the hand gestures, the method of speech, whether somebody nods all the time or they shake their heads, all of those things add to the depth of a character. So it's not just the man in the blue tie, but it's the man in the blue tie with a whole set of human foibles.
Right. But, you know, I know in my case, one thing that as an attorney, particularly as a younger attorney, I spent a hell of a lot of time in a library doing research. And so I discovered that, you know, when I got to the novel, it was relatively easy for me to do research. I mean, I'm good at that. I mean, that's just ingrained in me. So that's legal training that I appreciated. And then, you know, in my book also, there's some courtroom stuff and some other legal issues that arise here and there. And some of that stuff I just pulled straight out of my memory. So I didn't need to do any research, but other things I did, but that was relatively easy. So I was able, because of that, to spend most of my productive time actually writing the story. And I appreciated that. That was great because, as you say, it's a pure creative process. It comes right out of your brain and your imagination, which is great.
So is there some particular legal experience that you had that led to this problem that Jake gets himself involved in?
Not really, no. The plot of this story is a pure work of imagination. It is. Now, there are characters, particularly Jack's father, the Duke, as he refers to himself, who is an amalgam of people I've known. And so that's one thing. And I know people like that. And that's why it's easier for me, or was easier for me than it might have been for someone else, to write about that, to put a character with that strong a personality and those character flaws, to capture that. It was easier for me to do that because I've observed that. And as a lawyer, of course, that's what we do. We elicit facts, we observe people telling us stories, and we decide through cross-examination whether they're telling the truth or not. And I spent, you know, a lot of my time in courtrooms doing exactly that. So, you know, so that experience, I think, helped me a lot.
I find that this process of creating characters is it's so interesting because you meet somebody for the first time and it's a normal human reaction, but in the back of your brain, you're saying to yourself, is there something in this person that I can use in a book, in a character?
Yeah.
And it sort of changes your perspective on the way you look at just ordinary life.
It's funny. I just had that experience last weekend. I met a person in Key West that I'm definitely putting in the next book that I'm writing. He's in there. He's not going to be by name, but this person was so unusual and struck me in such a way that I just have to capture that. So yeah, I agree with you. And that changed my perspective really after I wrote this book. Because I'm looking at people differently. I used to just interact with them as anyone else would, unless of course they were a potential witness or something. But but now I do think of them as potential source material for what I'm doing.
There's one of the characters who appears repeatedly in the Koakane series is a character named Hook How, and Hook How came about because one morning I was in Hilo very early and they had a fish auction where the local fishermen would bring their fish in on these big coolers in the back of their pickup trucks. And they'd lay them all out on this little concrete floor, and an auctioneer would come around and he had a long gaff in his hand, and he'd lay the gaff on a fish and people would bid on that fish. Well, he was about almost 7 feet tall, bald, with rubber boots that came up high on his thighs, a little fish blood here and there. And, you know, he became a important character in the books. And I twisted him a little bit to make him a police informer to go along with everything else. But, you know, he's just stolen right out of life.
Yeah, and I that's great. And I know I've talked to some other novelists about this, and they've done the same thing. I guess that's just that goes with it. That's what we do.
You know, coming back to this issue of setting and character, characters develop through a book, hopefully, and they develop through a series, again, hopefully. One of the things I've thought about is how setting develops over time. And there's no place in the world that's better for that than Hawaii, because we have volcanoes that are literally reshaping the world there. And in each one of the books, there is some aspect of Hawaii which changes, and that change interacts with the characters. I mean, in Death of a Messenger, the weather atop Mauna Kea becomes a major source of problems for all of the participants. In Off the Grid, a lava flow changes the whole setting, sets up the death. In Fire and Vengeance, it's a volcanic eruption on Hualalai. In Retribution, it's a recently completed highway provides a particularly exciting moment in Koa's search to save, or his effort to save his lawyer. And so I find it interesting that the change in an environment actually creates a kind of development, like a change in characters.
Yeah, it's definitely true. And in Florida, Key West and Miami in particular, those two places, you know, everything can change with the tide. When the tide comes in and goes out, new things arrive on the beaches. And the topography of South Florida is changing every year now with hurricanes, sea level rise. We're at the forefront of all of that. And so things really do literally change. There are mangrove islands in the Middle Keys that don't exist anymore, that were just wiped out in the last two hurricanes. And you know, and so the ephemeral grip that we have on this planet is so obvious to me, and I kind of want to put some of this in my next book. But I haven't. It's none of that is in my first book, but except that, you know, the stuff that's on the ocean, and those things are important in the book.
So I'm now you've made me interested in. I'm looking forward to your next book, because I want to see how the character of South Florida develops.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, let me ask you this, and you touched on this earlier, but in terms of Hawaii and Hawaii as a character, one of the things you mentioned, and it well, certainly part of the culture, of course, but the language, which is such a fascinating part of what you're writing, is the inclusion of the Hawaiian language in the story. When I read the book, I wasn't distracted by it, which I thought I might be, but I wasn't. It was interesting to me, even though I couldn't pronounce a lot of the words. It was interesting, and it sounded melodic the way I would phonetically think it through. But how do you think about that and your inclusion of that in the book?
Well, once again, I mean, if setting is going to be a character, and it involves the culture and the people and the history, what is more important to human beings than language? I mean, it's the way in which we have built civilization is through the ability to communicate with each other, sometimes not so well and sometimes quite well. And so I needed to get the language into the book. Now, I don't speak Hawaiian, and the grammar in Hawaiian is actually reasonably complex. But I have this wonderful reader in Hawaii who reads the drafts and corrects all my Hawaiian because I really want it to be right, including all of the punctuation marks. But you're right, it's a very lyrical, musical language. And if you hear a good Hawaiian speaker, or you hear dance music or hula, and the hula competitions that they put on in Hilo, it's just it's marvelous. It's like music.
Yeah, I have heard quite a bit of that in my experience, and it is a beautiful spoken language, and I certainly hope it doesn't go away. I know, for example, in Native American culture, we have in Florida the Seminole tribe and the Miccosukee tribe, both of them very proud people, and they're very proud of their ancestry and their language that they're trying to hold on to. And I'm not sure it will survive, honestly.
Well, one of the stories about the Hawaiian language is that after the expropriation of the islands by the United States, the government forbid the use of the Hawaiian language in schools and in government functions. And it's not until really the 60s and 70s when Hawaiian language and Hawaiian scholarship in Hawaiian language really began to revive, and it's an ongoing process today. But it's a little like any conquering country wants to impose its culture on the conquered, and what is more important to culture than language?
Right. Yeah. Speaking of that.
What other authors have motivated you? Who did you look at?
That's a very interesting question, because my favorite authors are Leo Tolstoy and Ernest Hemingway. Completely different styles, completely. But I'm fascinated by both of them for different reasons. One of the things that plot is such a big deal with Tolstoy, and the very complicated plots with very detailed descriptions of action and character. Hemingway, great dialogue, direct to the point. His idea was, I want to say as much as possible with as few words as possible. And I admire that. And, for example, my book is not the longest book in the world. And that was in my thoughts as I was doing it, is that I wanted to try to keep it spare, keep the thing moving in the direction that was going to be satisfying to the reader. So those two, but in this realm that we're traveling in now, John Sanford, I admire quite a bit with his Lucas Davenport series, and Michael Connelly also with the Harry Bosch series. I think those are very well done in terms of plot and just the things you learn about different parts of the country. Harry Bosch is in Southern California, where you are, and I learn a lot about Southern California just from those books. And Lucas Davenport in Minnesota, another very interesting place. And so in those in all of Sanford's novels, you get some, just like you're talking about Hawaii, Minnesota becomes a little bit of a character in those books, which I admire.
Well, you and I share an affinity for those kinds of books. I mean, people like Jane Harper, who writes about the outback in Australia, and you can just feel the heat and the humidity coming through in her characters. It's very potent. Joy Ellis talks about the Fens in England. Again,
Right.
very, very obvious and very much a part of the stories.
Right.
Peter May is another one who does a really, really good job with settings, as does C.J. Box.
C.J. Box.
Montana.
Excellent.
I mean, just comes alive.
Yep.
And then I've always liked Barry Eisler, who's John Rain series, particularly the Japanese components of it. I mean, you learn. It's almost like being in Japan.
Right.
And again, very important use of language.
Right.
Not dissimilar from the Hawaiian that I've included. And then finally, another example, which is a totally different kind of mystery story, is Delia Owens and Where the Crawdads Sing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, talk about place being a character. The swamp is the character in that book.
Yeah.
I see our host has rejoined us.
We're joining it. I wanted to come on in that particular moment because you're talking about such great authors and such great books. And it's kind of leading to some of the questions that are coming in on Facebook. So I thought it was a good little segue for us. So one of the great comments that came in from Trisha was that she says it's interesting contrast to have two lawyers discussing the respective mysteries and genesis of their main character. So that was a great comment, which leads to the question of, and I'll pose it to you first, Robert, and then Jim, you can answer this. Why did you decide to write mysteries?
Well, I chose to write a mystery because I had this compelling need to tell the Hawaii story, and I didn't want to write a travel log. I wanted to write something that took advantage of my other skills, which include, as I've said earlier, a lot of investigation. So I was familiar with what detectives do. I tried to block a lot of what they did when I was representing my clients. And so that was sort of a logical way to go. And I had a lot of fun in creating Koakane, who is a very interesting character. I mean, this is a cop with a criminal past who brings two things to the stories. One is this passion, this absolute compelling passion to track down killers. And then the other thing is he's been there and he kind of knows how it's done. And so he brings an investigatory insight that lots of other police might not have.
Okay, I love it. And Jim, how about you? What made you decide to write mysteries?
Well, I mean, I've written one.
Well, you got the other one on the works. The other one's on the works.
Now, having said that, my story, while it is certainly a mystery, and that is important, obviously, for the purposes of this discussion, at least, it didn't start out that way for me. This story for me is it's a young man's path toward redemption for himself. That's what this story is. And whether he finds it or not is an open question. Or if he did, whether he recognizes that that's what's happened, whether he's been redeemed. And in order to have him go down that path, I wanted to set him in a set of tragic circumstances. And so that's where his mother's apparent suicide comes in, and that creates the mystery as to what really happened to her. But it's his path that is most important and most compelling to me. That's what I was really trying to write, but the mystery creates the opportunity for that.
And probably both of you as lawyers, truth is probably stranger than fiction in what you've seen in the real world versus what you're creating.
My wife and I share news stories frequently with the expression, you can't make this stuff up.
Right? Yeah. Exactly. Okay, another question that's coming in. But before we get to your question, I have to agree with you, Jim. I love it. Kind of tells a little bit about our personalities that I love John Sanford too. Yeah. his prey books back in the day, those were just I couldn't devour them fast enough. Oh, They're so good. Okay, Fazia. And we will ask, we're going to go to Jim first on this one. Do you ever encounter writer's block? And if so, how do you manage it?
I have not experienced that yet.
That's a good thing.
It is, it's funny. And I think it's in part because of my legal training. I've had to write lengthy briefs or memos for judges or senior partner when I was a young lawyer under heavy time constraints. And so when there's a gun to your head and you've got to get something done, you get it done.
Yeah.
So now that I have no time constraints, I still find no problem just sitting down. And once I decide to start writing, it just comes. It just flows right out of me.
I love it. How about you, Robert? Do you have any writer's block?
When I get to a point where I don't know which way it ought to go, what I do is I will outline, very briefly outline 4 or 5 or 6 different paths that the story could take from that point forward. And by the time I finish doing that, I will have decided which one of those paths I'm going to go down.
Yeah, I think you're right, though. Both of your training as lawyers, it's like the blank page doesn't scare you.
No, that's true.
You're going to go into that blank page. So, Jim, to your second book now, pardon me if you've already answered this, but I was doing some technical stuff in the background when you were talking about their books. Is your second book are you a series, or is it your standalone, or are they 2 standalones?
No, this is going to be a follow-up. Jack Gerard is going to be in the next book, and it's going to pick up with him about 2 years after the events in the first book. Okay.
And then, Robert, I think you said you might be working on something maybe a little different than.
Well, I want to keep the Koa Kane series alive.
Okay.
And each of those is an independent story, but they've involved the same characters, and there's character development through the series.
But you can read them. We can read them out of order.
You can read them out of order.
Okay.
But I'm also working on something else, which takes me back to the Washington days in my legal career, and all of the rather strange and unusual things that happen in that city.
And probably are still happening.
Well, yes, that's true. Although they've moved to Florida recently.
Good one.
Maybe maybe you guys can collaborate on a book or something on that. Yeah. I always like to ask, there's a couple more questions that I want to ask too, because back to your, when you talk about not having the writer's block, Jim, do you have a certain time of day? What's your writing process? Do you have a certain time of day? Do you work like normal hours, or what do you do on that?
Well, I find that writing for 3 or 4 hours, whenever I do it, is about my limit. That's about it. After that, I feel like I'm stale, and it's just time to do something else. And so that's what I do. And most of the time, I do that in the middle of the day. That's where I'm at. When I get up in the morning, I'm a little groggy, and it takes me a minute or two to kind of get into the day.
Right.
So I can find myself at about 11 o'clock, sitting down to get some writing done. I'll do that. Then I'll go to the gym, and and the rest of the day takes care of itself.
Awesome. I think I want that life. Robert, Robert, how about you? Do you have a certain time of day? Do you write every day?
Well, there's actually 2 answers to that question. I spent 20 years writing the first book, because that's when I was actively practicing, and I would go on vacation and I would write a chapter, and then, life would overtake things and I wouldn't pick it up for another month or 2 months or 6 months. And finally, after I retired, I decided I was finally going to get serious and put this book together. So that period was snatching whatever period of time I could, whether it was on an airplane trip or a vacation. Now I work on it most days. There's no real schedule. I have my laptop. I'm known to take it with me whenever I feel the urge to write, and so. But usually every day I'll put some time in on it.
Awesome. Questions coming in to you, Bob. Will the Koa Kane series be adapted for television?
I hope. If the person who made the inquiry has any juice in that direction, I'd love to talk to them.
Right? Because that's a whole other ballgame, boy. I mean, you write these books, but then that whole TV thing becomes a whole other thing.
It's really stalled right now because of the writers' strike too. There's really not a lot going on.
No, and that's devastating to so many people, because it's amazing. That's a almost an economy in itself, and how many people are the legs of the people that it impacts. Is really, really devastating, actually.
And how it's all going to change with AI.
Oh.
Which is, really another topic we could.
Boy,
spend
we
hours
want to
on.
come back and have a conversation about AI. Let me tell you, that could be a whole other hour. We could talk about that. Oh, that's a scary one. But we'll go back to this a little bit. So I'm always fascinated too. And Jim, we'll go to you on this one. The title of the book, was that always your working title, or did you come to that?
I came to it. Those words actually appear in the text of the book. It's a description and it is an apt description at the time that Jack is seeing this. But it also, for me, it sort of resonates and it creates the mood of the book itself. And it's not, it's not a tearjerker, but it captures, I think, a certain mood. And that's what I was going for.
Awesome. And how about you, Robert? Was Retribution always the working title of this one?
Actually, on Retribution, it always was the working title, because the whole idea of the book for me was Retribution.
Right.
On some of the other titles, it's a little bit of a community decision involving agent and publisher. And the publisher has a strong voice in that.
Those marketing people have a lot to say about those titles, don't they? They're usually, most of the time they're right, I have to say.
Well, they're much better when they've read the book.
Yeah, that is true. Gentlemen, it's been wonderful having you. Jim, if somebody wants to find out more, do you have some social media handles you want to share with anybody, or where to find you?
You can find me on Facebook. I've got a website, jamespolkinghorn.com.
Okay.
That's pretty much where I'm at.
Perfect. How about you, Robert?
RobertBMcCaw.com is probably the best place to go. And I've got some, little pieces I've written, parts about the story, reviews, all that kind of stuff is up there.
Fantastic. Well, when the next two books come out, let's come back and have a conversation about those.
Would love to do it.
It'd be great.
All right.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks
All right.
for coming in. And thank you both for being here.
It was great.
Thank you for having us.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.